for 7.5 years, and this is honestly a great place to go to church to worship God. There are great people here, and I'm so excited to be able to study God's Word with you this evening. Tonight, I hope you're ready. We've got a challenging passage. It is a great passage, but it is a challenging passage because Jesus is going to step on our toes tonight. And he is going to really motivate us and challenge us to start thinking differently about the way that we respond to people who mistreat us. The passage that we're going to read tonight comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And it's Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 48. And that's the passage where Jesus talks about turning the other cheek when people are mistreating us, and loving our enemies and praying for people who persecute us. Again, really, really challenging stuff. Let me fill you in on what's happening here at Westside and how this class fits into what we're talking about on Sunday mornings as well. So Sunday mornings, our sermon series is called Taking Jesus Seriously. And what I and our youth minister Adam have really been trying to draw out from the scriptures is the fact that Jesus has a really high standard for people. Like sometimes we forget that Jesus really sets the bar high, and he has a lot of difficult teachings for us. It's honestly overwhelming sometimes to think about passages like love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. You can't love God or money, you have to choose. You got to take up a cross and be willing to give up everything to follow Jesus. All of that sounds so intimidating. What's easier for us to do is kind of pretend like Jesus didn't say all that controversial stuff. We try and maybe water it down a little bit, or only focus on the parts of Jesus' teachings that we get instantly, that are easy to follow. And we would honestly prefer that Jesus had not said all of those really challenging things. But instead of kind of brushing it off or brushing it aside, we're really calling one another to take the words of Jesus seriously. Don't ignore it. Don't water it down. Don't pretend like he's saying something different than what he's really saying. Let's lean into it. Let's admit and accept that Jesus does have a high standard, and really encourage one another to rely on God's strength to rise to the occasion. So this is going to be one of those passages that's really challenging, and I don't want us to brush it off or ignore it. I want us to start asking the question, how can we really start to put this into practice in our lives? So without further ado, here is Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. All right, so what's Jesus talking about here? You probably heard that phrase, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, that goes back to the Old Testament legal code. And that's something that the people of God would have been really familiar with. I mean, Jesus says, look, you guys have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. He's talking about something that was written down in the law of Moses. And this is actually part of a pattern. In this section of the sermon where we picked up, Jesus is engaging in the same pattern over and over. He talks about something from the Old Testament law. He talks about how people of his day, first century Jewish context, were putting that into practice and recognizing that the people of God didn't always fully understand or apply those teachings in the right way. Jesus is saying, I want to help you understand the real intent behind why God gave you that law. So let me offer you the final authoritative interpretation and application of that principle that all of you have heard about before. So when it comes to eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, let me fully expand on that and fully explain why God gave you that legal principle all the way back in the Old Testament. Now, a lot of times when we think of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, we think about it as giving permission for the victim to seek revenge against the person who harmed them, up to and including whatever it is that was done to them. So you gouge out my eye, I get to go gouge yours out. You steal my Xbox, I demolish yours, or something like that. Whatever is done to me, I get to do it to you. And the principle of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is actually approaching that problem or that subject from the opposite direction. So instead of empowering victims to seek revenge, really what it's doing is it is serving as a guardrail to prevent victims from retaliating in a way that escalates the situation instead of simply responding proportionally. And here's what I mean. God knows the human heart. He knows our temptation to want to go and seek revenge above and beyond what was done to us. And we see this when families start to get in a feud. It starts with something small, the other family retaliates a little bit bigger, and then they respond a little bit bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it snowballs into something that's completely out of control. Eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth was designed to limit retaliation that snowballs into this crazy situation that's escalated far beyond the severity of the original crime. Now, let me quote from you from the NIV application commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, because the author of that, Michael Wilkins, really explains the heart behind eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth as I'm trying to explain it here. And here's what he says. In some ancient societies, punishment was handed out without regard for individual cases, and often the penalty far exceeded the crime. The law of retaliation was established as a check to inappropriate punishment. If a person harmed the eye of another person, the eye of the offender was to be given as equal punishment. The law was intended as an equalizer of justice, to prevent victims from responding in an over-the-top way that escalates the situation and causes an ongoing feud. Eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth was established to set an upper boundary on what the punishment would be. It is not about giving the victim permission to do exactly what was done to them. And I think that's one way that we sometimes misread what eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is really all about. Another way that we misread it is we read it through individual eyes. If I'm harmed, I have the right to immediately go out and seek revenge or get justice or to do to them what they did to me. But it's not meant to be a principle of individual retaliation. Eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth was a legal principle that had to do with the institutional legal system, meaning this is the way that courts, the Jewish courts, were supposed to operate. It is a principle that guided their deliberations on how to punish offenders when they did something to a victim. It was never meant to empower individuals to go outside of the legal system and get revenge or seek retaliation on their own. And you can read about the emphasis on the official system, the judicial system, the court system in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 15 through 21. So this was meant to say, if you are a victim of some sort of violent crime, do the right thing, gather the witnesses, present your case to the elders, the judges, etc., and they will consider all of that. They'll take it all under advisement, and they will consult the scriptures, they will consult the witnesses, they'll understand what the law is, what the punishment is supposed to be, and the upper limit of the punishment in that legal setting should be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's the context in which eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth occurs. The problem is, when it came to the first century, when Jesus is speaking to the people, when it came to the first century, the people who were most likely to cause trouble for the Jewish people, the people most likely to harm them, insult them, mock them, steal from them, etc., it wasn't going to be their fellow Jews. It was going to be the Roman army that was occupying their homeland. The Roman soldiers who were there and had the legal right to say, hey, you there, pick up my gear and walk a mile with me because I'm tired and I don't want to do it. It was the Roman soldiers who were most likely to cause harm or offense towards the Jews. Do you think that the Jewish people were able to haul those Roman soldiers into court and lay out their case in front of a judge? And do you think that judge is going to say, oh yeah, you Jewish peasant over here, of course we'll let you, get your revenge on this Roman soldier? Man, no way. The Jewish people really didn't have a legal recourse to seek justice from those Romans. Again, from Michael Wilkins' commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. The common person was at the mercy of the Romans everywhere. On the street, in the court, in the presence of the military occupying forces, and in the everyday world of financial need. Jewish leaders had little or no power to execute justice to protect their people. Those who were hurt wanted to strike back, especially when there was no apparent justice to protect them. So, personal retaliation through violent resistance was a burning issue among the Jews. And by Jesus' day, there was an entire group of people called the Zealots who wanted to grab their knives and they wanted to go stab all the Romans they could and start this popular uprising against the Romans and purge them from Israel. So this was a real thing. People were very upset at the Romans and they were saying, look, we know the Old Testament law says eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. We know that's the upper limit of what we're allowed to do in the court system, but there's no courts here. None that are going to hear our case. We can't take the Romans to court, so so I guess we better go and fight them. And there was this idea that because the courts were unavailable, that threw everything else out the window, and it gave you the right to go and seek retaliation and justice and revenge however you saw fit. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not at all what the intent of that, command in the Old Testament is. Even though you no longer have the ability to take them to court in the way that you would prefer, you don't get to go out and get revenge or seek retaliation through violent means. Instead, he talks about all these ways that disciples of Jesus need to show humility and deference and submit themselves to people who are without a doubt evil. I mean, just evil people, and that's the language that Jesus uses. So one of the ways that we try to minimize the severity of what Jesus is saying, the way that we try and water it down, is we start asking these questions like, okay, but who exactly does Jesus have in mind when he's talking about don't resist an evil person? Because look, if we're going to be a lawyer and try and find the loophole, then maybe we can say, all right, the evil people that Jesus are talking about, it's really just the mildly evil people that we're supposed to submit to. Because clearly Jesus couldn't mean submit to those really evil people. Like, he doesn't expect us to do that. That's crazy. What he's really talking about is submit yourself to mildly rude people who give you a dirty look or something like that. And that's all he's really talking about. So sometimes we kind of go through these mental gymnastics to try and explain away what Jesus is really teaching. So let's just take a look at that. Who is Jesus actually talking about here? And all of this actually reminds me of another story in the Bible where I think it was a religious teacher, comes to Jesus and he's talking about the greatest commands, and Jesus talks about loving God and loving your neighbor. And the Bible says that this man wanted to justify himself. And so he asked this question, well, who is my neighbor? And he was hoping that the definition of neighbor would be so narrow that it would be easy to follow this teaching. Love the person who lives to your left, love the person who lives to your right, and that's it. You got two neighbors and that's it. If that's the definition of neighbor, that command is easy. Sometimes, I think we look at this passage, don't resist an evil person. If we can get evil people to be just a handful of people in the world, and Jesus gives us permission to fight back and resist and retaliate against everyone else, that makes this teaching a lot easier. But let's find out what he's really talking about here. You can start with just the dictionary definition of this word of evil and look it up in a Greek dictionary of the Bible that looks at how this word is used in the Bible and other ancient literature of this time. And based off of the context of all those other usages, they give us an explanation of what this word means. And it basically means exactly what you think it means: morally or socially worthless, wicked, evil, bad, base, vicious, degenerate, and evildoer. My kids are obsessed with stories of good and evil. They like Star Wars a lot right now. They also like Ninjago. They like Paw Patrol at different times. I mean, they're drawn to these stories where there's good guys and bad guys, and they always want to know when a new character is introduced, is he a good guy or a bad guy? Jesus is talking about the bad guys here. Do not resist an evil person. One of the things that we can do beyond look at the dictionary definition of what that word meant and how it's used in the Bible and other ancient literature is look at the examples of people in the Bible who are called evil, like this same word. Because the Bible uses this word in a lot of stories to talk about a lot of people who did messed up stuff. And looking at these different stories helps us understand what Jesus had in mind when he talks about a person who's truly evil. So let me just give you a few examples of these, and I'm going to go through them quickly because the details of every story aren't that important. It's just the overall feel that the people Jesus is talking about here are like the worst of the worst. And it really is, kind of submitting ourselves to even the worst people imaginable. But basically, go back to the story of the flood, where God was so remorseful that he created people because he saw how evil they were, that their hearts were only evil all the time. Like the condition of mankind right before God wiped everything out and started over, the Bible uses the word evil to describe humanity at that point in time, and it wasn't very good. Fast forward a little bit in Genesis, the story of Joseph. His brothers beat him up, stole his clothes, left him for dead, and then decided to sell him into slavery. The Bible uses the word evil to describe their actions towards him, their attitudes towards him. And that is one that's pretty obvious. It's obvious that they were acting in a very evil way towards him. I love Joseph's perspective on it, though. Towards the end of his life, he saw how God was working everything out for the good of those who love him. And he says to his brothers, after everything is kind of revealed about who he is and how he saved them, As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Like, it's remarkable that he could have that positive perspective on the terrible life that he had and the way that he was mistreated. When Israel came into the promised land, and first they were ruled by judges, and then they were ruled by kings, they got into this pattern of doing good for a little bit, worshiping God and doing the right thing, but then like that generation would, die off, and the next one would come up, and the Bible would say that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And that was like a total rejection of the Lord, an abandonment of God's laws, worshiping idols, worshiping false gods, blending in with the culture around him. And the Bible uses this phrase, they did evil in the eyes of the Lord, to describe that complete rejection of God. Another example of someone who's truly evil would be Haman in the book of Esther. And Haman was this like Persian, ruler, and he was so offended that Mordecai, this Jewish person, did not bow down to him and give him honor. He was so offended by that, he used his position of power to order the genocide of all of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire. So he's offended that one guy didn't bow down to him, and he orders that all of the Jews be killed because of it. In Esther chapter 7, verse 6, Esther finally reveals like that Haman is this awful, terrible guy to the king. And she says he's a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. It's the word wicked there. That's the kind of, evildoer, evil person that Jesus is talking about. Go into the New Testament, and this is used to describe some really like immoral people as well. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, there's a man in the church who's having a relationship with his father's wife. And whether that's his biological mother or perhaps more likely stepmother, Paul singles this out as a kind of relationship that is just evil and immoral. And he quotes some of the passages in the Old Testament to say you need to kick that person out of your assembly because their conduct is just totally unbecoming of a disciple of Jesus Christ. So that is an evil, wicked person, immoral person. And then one more would just be in Acts chapter 17. There's this angry, violent mob of people that starts a riot in Thessalonica to try and stir up trouble for the Christian church there, the disciples there. And the Bible calls them, this wicked, evil group of people. So, look at all those stories, and you have people that are so evil that God wanted to wipe the world out. People who are plotting genocide, people rejecting the Lord, really immoral, relationships, persecuting the church. I mean, basically, this is talking about the worst of the worst. When Jesus talks about don't resist an evil person, I mean, don't resist even the worst people imaginable. Submit yourselves to them, go along with their terrible plans, don't try and seek revenge against them. It's crazy the sort of level of evil that Jesus is referencing here. At least it's the same word is used to describe all these other acts of evil in the Bible. So it really is a high bar. It's a challenging passage because he's saying, don't resist even the worst of the worst. And you'll notice in this passage, there's 4 specific applications of that. So he talks about, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And then he runs through 4 specific examples that were somewhat likely to happen for the people that Jesus was talking to. Like there's a good chance that maybe they would have experienced one of these personally. One is if someone slaps you on the cheek. And there's obviously the physical pain that comes with that, but that would have been like a direct challenge to a person, like an insult, or you're mocking them or you're challenging them. It's a symbolic way of affronting a person's dignity and honor. So it's really just humiliating, and your natural response is when you're picked on or humiliated is to respond and to get even, to try and restore your sense of dignity. But Jesus says instead of getting even, turn the other cheek and be willing to endure even more suffering and shame instead of getting even. The next one is if someone sues you in court. And this is talking about the difference between like a shirt and a tunic or a cloak or something like that. And if someone sues you trying to take your property, like obviously the natural response is to want to fight back and get even and make your case in court. And what Jesus is saying is, okay, just give them the shirt, number one, don't even bother with the court, just give them your shirt. And on top of that, give them your outer tunic, your outer cloak as well. And if you were a relatively poor person visiting Jesus because you heard he's like handing out tons of free food, so you want to go get like a free meal and you want to hear his teaching, The idea of that outer cloak or tunic is actually super important. It was like one of the most valuable things that a poorer person could own, because in Israel at night, especially in the winter, it gets really, really cold. And that outer cloak or tunic was like your last line of defense against the elements. It's the one thing you had that would keep you warm at night. And in fact, that particular art of clothing was so important, so necessary for poor people, that if you were to ever pawn it off, like use it as collateral to borrow money, the person that you're borrowing money from was required by the law of Moses to return that cloak to you that evening. They weren't even allowed to keep it for 24 hours because God knew that poor person would need their cloak, their tunic that night in order to keep warm. It was a necessity, something that was essential just for survival. So Jesus is saying, if someone asks to take one thing, don't just give it to them, but give to them sacrificially as well. Give to them something that you deem to be necessary, an essential thing that you need. That is a really radical teaching when you understand the importance of that outer cloak, of that tunic. He also talks about walking the extra mile. And so we actually use this phrase a ton in modern English, and it doesn't even have to do with a religious context some of the times, going the extra mile. The people who were most likely to show up and demand something of the Jews would be those Roman soldiers that I talked about. This is the case in all of human history. The people who have the most power pretty much set the rules, and they get to do whatever they want. And it doesn't matter if it was like the Persian Empire, like the Greek army, the Roman Empire. When they showed up and they were the conquerors, they called the shots. They had absolute power to order the Jewish commoners around, tell them to go and, pick up my gear and walk with me. Help us build this road. You're going to go do, manual labor for the Roman Empire, and you're going to enjoy every minute of it. They had the absolute power to do that, because what's the alternative? You fight back against the Romans? You say no and rot in a Roman prison somewhere? I mean, they had final authority to basically boss the Jewish people around. Jesus was telling them to submit to this evil empire, not only to submit, but to even go above and beyond what they're called to do. One example of this is actually in the story of Jesus' crucifixion, and Jesus falls and he's not able to carry the cross the rest of the way. The Romans order someone who was just there, Simon of Cyrene, to pick up that cross and to carry it, and that would have been totally allowed according to the customs of the day. The fourth example that Jesus talks about here would be giving money to people who are begging, people who are asking for it, and lending money to people that they're just not going to pay you back. And in both instances, we might have this temptation to say, I'm not really sure if they deserve it. I'm not really sure what they're going to do with it. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a waste. And so we might hold back. But instead of holding back, Jesus says, give generously anyway. And honestly, like, we struggle with this. I struggle with this. Like, I see someone who's obviously in need, and I wonder, if I give them assistance, am I actually helping? Am I enabling bad behavior sometime? Am I stopping them from learning to be a little bit more, self-reliant? Like, there's this internal dialogue that I've had, and I'm sure you've had it too. But it almost feels like Jesus is saying, sometimes it's not about what they're going to do with it, but whether or not you're willing to give. And sometimes those situations, it's really a test of our willingness to sacrifice for someone else, our willingness to give something up. Are we willing to let something go? And sometimes that is the real purpose of that encounter. They might not use it in a great way. You might not really be helping in the best possible way. I mean, it's possible, but it could be that that's really a test of your willingness to give instead. And so Jesus is saying, when someone asks you, give freely. If someone wants to borrow money from you and you're pretty sure they're not going to be able to pay it back, give anyway. The idea here is to have an attitude of giving, a lifestyle of giving, an attitude of serving, even in response to really unjust treatment. And boy, is that challenging to put into practice. But we shouldn't avoid it. We shouldn't run away from it. We should lean into it and ask for the strength that we need from God and His Spirit to actually put those things into practice. In the next passage here, the next part of it, Matthew 5:43 through 48, it says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Again, quotes the Old Testament, but the only part of that that's actually in the Bible is the love your neighbor part. The hate your enemy part was more like the Jewish people taking bits and pieces of other passages, blending it all up, putting it back together, and then they ended up thinking God wants us to hate our enemies. Again, not really ever stated or commanded in the Old Testament, but there's little pieces and elements of that. I mean, God did command Israel to go and destroy their enemies, but he never said, I want you to hate them, I want you to be racist toward them, I want you to, look down upon them or condescend them. Like he never came out and said, hate your enemies the way that they were putting it into practice. So here's how Jesus reminds them of the true purpose, or the real heart behind that. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And here's where we need to draw a really fine line, a really fine distinction, because we know that God hates all kinds of things. He hates evil. He hates sin. He hates when people abuse others, take advantage of others. Like God is not this, emotionless being who's up there just kind of chilling in heaven and he's totally okay with everything that's happening in this world. He has the full range of emotions. He gets angry. He gets upset, especially when sin and evil and injustice occur in the world. So we know there are things that God hates, but we need to draw a really, really clear distinction here. The Bible teaches us to hate the things that are evil. The Bible does not teach us to hate people that we think are doing evil things, right? That's a big difference, We are called to hate and oppose sin and evil, the things that are evil, while loving the people who are committing those evil things. And that gets really challenging, and sometimes that bleeds together, and it's honestly hard to live that out in practice. But here's what it says in Romans chapter 12. Paul is writing this. It sounds a lot like what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Paul tells us to hate things that are evil, but to bless people who are persecuting us. In other words, we are called to hate the things that are evil, but bless the people who do wrong, even bless people who do wrong to us. So there's a difference here between evil itself and sin and injustice as a concept, the evil things that are taking place, and the people who are engaging in those evil practices. We're called to bless the people while hating the things that they're doing that are wrong. And that gets really complicated really quick. But that is the high bar that Jesus is setting for us. Now, here's the question that I wrestle with, I struggle with. Sometimes I think, Jesus, this one is honestly too difficult for anyone to follow. How can anyone love their enemies? How can anyone love the person who's mistreating them? How can anyone have that much care and concern for someone that they know is opposing them and couldn't care less about them? Doesn't it feel like it's completely unrealistic sometimes? So I think about that question, and it's like Jesus answers it by just pointing to himself, by pointing to God and saying, yeah, isn't it crazy how much you must love someone if you were going to sacrifice yourself for an enemy? Like, isn't it crazy to think about someone sacrificing themselves for someone that doesn't even love them back? That's exactly what God has done for us. If we can stop and remember that God loved us while we were his enemies, maybe, just maybe, that's the perspective we need to actually love our enemies in our day-to-day living. If we can stop and think that Jesus died for us while we were enemies, while we were still sinners, maybe that'll give us the strength we need to bless those who persecute us, to pray for those who persecute us. Here's what it says, Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Hey, that's you and that's me. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? The Bible talks about Jesus dying for the ungodly, dying for sinners, dying for his enemies. Jesus took the first step to show how much he loved us while we were actively opposing him. And the love that Jesus had for all of us, that's what transforms us and causes us to say, Jesus, I am sorry. I'm done being your enemy. I'm done opposing you. And now I'm ready to join you and to follow you as Lord and Savior. It is the love of Jesus that transforms enemies into friends. And that's the spiritual journey that all of us are on. When you read this passage in the Sermon on the Mount, man, it is challenging. It challenges us to set aside our desire to get even, to seek out revenge. It challenges our temptation to be a little bit stingy with our money, with our willingness to be generous. And really what this passage is calling us to is to say, look, we need to work hard to overcome the influence of sin and evil in our world. Don't ignore sin. Don't ignore evil. Don't tolerate it. Work against the things that are evil, especially when people are getting mistreated, like people are being abused, taken advantage of. We need to work hard to seek justice and to stand up for the oppressed. But that never gives us the right to go and hate people who are doing evil. So fight against evil in the world while still loving and blessing those who are persecuting us. Following Jesus means foregoing our perceived right to get even, foregoing our temptation to retaliate and to respond in kind. Following Jesus means living and loving generously no matter what, whether we think they deserve it or not. And I've kind of mentioned this already, but to love and to pray for anyone that you consider an enemy. That's a challenging teaching. Don't run away from it. Lean into it. Embrace it. Look at the example of Jesus who gave up everything for you while you were still his enemy. And may that give you the strength that you need to bless those who persecute you, to love your enemies, and to turn the other cheek. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that tonight has been a blessing to you. I know it's been challenging, but thank you so much for sticking with me as we work through this difficult teaching together. I hope you're having a fantastic week, and we hope to see you